Evolution is what it's ended up being. In particular, in the nearshore, it's been a dramatic transformation. The nearshore is a very important bridge between the upland and marine systems, and it is a critical link between the two that kind of make both work. For 100 years, a wall of concrete held this river by the throat. The salmon that once ran up the Elwha by the hundreds of thousands were choked down to almost nothing, and the summer steelhead all but vanished. For seasons of counting turned up 3 fish. Everyone assumed that was the end. The dams were built in the early 1900s. We saw the fish populations decline to where we weren't sure how long we were going to be able to feed our people. Then the dams came down, and the river did something biologists call close to impossible. It came roaring back to life. And the steelhead, the run the experts had buried, came back with it because of a secret the concrete had been keeping for a century. Before the concrete, the Elwha was not an ordinary river. It ran a little over 45 m down from the heart of the Olympic Mountains to the sea. And along that entire length, it did something almost no other river in the lower 48 could do. It carried every single kind of Pacific salmon and sea-run trout native to the region. 10 distinct stocks in one watershed. Spring Chinook, summer Chinook, fall Chinook, coo, chum, pink, sackeye, summer steelhead, winter steelhead, plus bull trout and cutthroat living right alongside them. And the Elwha's Chinook were the stuff of legend. This river grew king salmon that reached nearly 100 pounds. It's a very quiet place in a very tumultuous world. I've been working in the nearshore. I think I started my first conversations about the Elwha nearshore were in 1995. Roughly the size of a grown man, muzzling their way up through a narrow rock gorge the locals called Goblin's Gate. As far back as 1790, a Spanish explorer named Manuel Camper wrote down that he had bought 100-pound salmon from the indigenous people living at the mouth of this river. For the lower Elwha Klum tribe, the river was never scenery. It was the center of everything. Food, ceremony, identity, all of it moving with the fish. And it had moved that way for thousands of years before anyone ever thought to touch it. Here's what made the place almost unfair. Most of the watershed sits inside what is now Olympic National Park. Cold, pristine, protected, wild. On nearly every other salmon river you can name, the fight is against 1,000 small wounds at once. Logging and farming and pollution and sprawl all bleeding the water at the same time. On the Elwha, the upper river had almost none of that. The habitat was already close to perfect. Biologists later estimated that close to 400,000 adult salmon and steelhead surge back into this river every single year to spawn. 400,000. Picture water so thick with fish you could nearly walk across their backs. The only thing standing between those fish and one of the finest spawning grounds on the entire Olympic Peninsula was going to be 2 walls of concrete. And the man who set out to build the first one had absolutely no intention of following the law. The businessman. In 1910, none of what was coming was visible yet. There was just a businessman, a canyon, and a river that had no idea what was about to happen to it. The businessman's name was Thomas Alwell. And when Alwell looked at the Elwha, he saw one thing above everything else: electricity. He saw a canyon he could plug to power the growing mills of Port Angeles. So he quietly bought up land along the river, partnered with a Canadian financier named George Glind, and began building the Elwha Dam about 5 m up from the sea. There was a problem, and it was not a small one. Washington State had passed a law back in 1890 that required every single dam to include a way for fish to pass, a fish ladder. It was written down plainly, and it was the law. The Chinook salmon, coo, steelhead, chum, bull trout, and all of those are federally listed as being endangered species. Alwell ignored it. He built no passage at all. Then he cut a second corner that would come back to haunt the whole project, failing to properly anchor the base of the dam to the bedrock beneath it. And that shortcut, that illegal corner he cut, is going to end up maturing more than almost anything else in this entire story, though not in any way he could ever have imagined. Nature noticed the sloppy work long before the courts did. In 1912, as the reservoir filled behind the unfinished dam, the bottom simply blew out. Water and debris tore downstream in a wall. Alwell found new funding, rebuilt, and by 1913, the Elwha Dam stood complete, sealing the river with no way through for a single salmon. Not everyone stayed quiet about it. A Clum County game warden named James Pike had already seen exactly where this was heading. As early as 1911, with the dam still under construction, Pike was writing to the state fish commissioner, warning that thousands of salmon were piling up below the concrete with nowhere left to go. He watched them gather at the base of the wall, driven by an instinct millions of years old to push upstream, throwing themselves again and again at a barrier that would never open. Nobody with the power to act listened. And 14 years later, they would go and do the exact same thing all over again. Only this time taller. 2 walls. In 1927, a second and even taller barrier, the Glines Canyon Dam, rose 8 m further upstream. 2 walls now, and above them more than 90% of the Elwha's spawning habitat went dark in a single stroke. The math here is brutal, and it is worth saying plainly. When the 2 dams went in, roughly 90% of the salmon habitat vanished, and the fish populations that depended on it fell by an estimated 98%. A river that once welcomed nearly 400,000 fish a year was strangled down to a fraction, crowded into the last few miles below the lower dam. It did not happen as one dramatic collapse. It happened as a slow, century-long suffocation. Less every year, fewer fish, fewer of the giants, until the 100 PB kings existed only in faded photographs and the memories of the oldest people left on the river. And one run took it harder than any of the others, the summer steelhead. These are a rare prized fish, the kind that enter a river in the warm months and then hold there for months before they finally spawn. And to survive that long wait, they need the cold water of the upper reaches. The dams cut them off from exactly that water. Trapped in the warm, shrinking lower river with the high country sealed away above them, they had nowhere left to endure the summer. By the time modern scientists were counting, wild summer steelhead in the Elwha were considered functionally extinct, gone as a working population. But the river was hiding something, and it is the single strangest twist in this whole story. So if a river clawing its way back from the dead is the kind of thing you live for, do me one favor before we go any further and subscribe to the American Wild, because you're going to want to be right here for what that wall was quietly protecting the entire time. What the dam trapped. When the Glines Canyon Dam sealed off the upper Wed, it did not just trap water. It trapped fish. Rainbow trout stranded above the concrete generation after generation for 100 years. And here is the one detail you have to hold on to because it becomes everything later. A rainbow trout and a summer steelhead are the same species, the same fish. The only difference between them is that a steelhead swims out to the ocean and comes back. A dam removals isn't just about pulling dams for fish passage, although that's certainly a big part of it. It's also about liberating wood and liberating sediment. And a rainbow trout stays home its whole life. Those landlocked trout above the dam were carrying the full genetic blueprint of their Seron ancestors, filed away and used, waiting for a door that had been welded shut since 1927. Every one of them was, in a sense, a steelhead that had simply never been allowed to leave. They kept the instructions. They just had nowhere on earth left to use them. For a century, that door stayed shut. The tribe watched their river empty out. The great 100 PB Chinook faded into stories. And the dams, by now owned by a paper company called Crown Zellerbach, just kept grinding out a modest trickle of power, aging, cracking, and quietly holding an entire ecosystem hostage. Nobody was coming to open that wall on the fish's behalf. If it was ever going to come down, somebody was going to have to force it down, and forcing it was going to swallow the better part of a human lifetime. The long fight. By the 1970s, the lower Elwha Clum tribe had already spent decades pushing to bring the dams down, and they were no longer pushing alone. In 1974, a landmark court ruling affirmed the treaty fishing rights of Washington tribes. And slowly, the legal and scientific weight of the whole thing began to shift their way. Conservation groups lined up behind them. Fisheries biologists laid out a case that surprised a lot of people because fixing this river, they argued, did not mean adding fish ladders at all. The studies were blunt about it. Even with the best modern passage technology money could buy, leaving the dam standing would never bring the salmon back the way full removal could, because the finest spawning gravel sat far upstream in cold water only a free-flowing river could ever reach. Now that the dams are out, The visual aspect of it is so dramatic that the nearshore has actually become the poster child for the entire dam removal project. In 1992, the fight reached Washington, D.C. Congress passed the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act, and President George H.W. Bush signed it into law. The goal was written down in black and white. Take out both dams, bring back the salmon, and then even with a federal law on the books, it crawled. There were years of political trench warfare. One senator worked to strangle the funding while another fought to force it through. The timber industry pushed back hard. Some local residents feared for their power and their property. For a while, it looked like the whole effort might die in committee, strangled not by concrete, but by paperwork and politics. It took the federal government until the year 2000 to actually buy the dams and years more of negotiation with the tribe, the National Park Service, and the city of Port Angeles before a final plan was finally locked in. Building the dams had taken a few short years. Deciding to remove them ate up nearly a lifetime. Frances Charles, chairwoman of the Lower Elwha tribe, would later put words to that endurance, thanking the tribal members who kept telling one another year after year not to give up and to stay the course. That patience was about to be tested one final time, because it turned out that taking a dam down safely was far harder than anyone who ever built one had bothered to worry about. Unbuilding a wall. On September 15, 2011, it finally began. And it did not happen in one dramatic instant. No matter how the story sometimes gets told, tearing out these two dams was a careful staged demolition that stretched across 3 full years. Crews worked from barges, chipping and cutting the concrete down in controlled layers. At the tougher structure, engineers used precisely placed blasting to break the taller Glines Canyon Dam apart, section by section. Notch a piece, let the river drop, let it settle, then notch again. It was less like an explosion and more like unbuilding a wall, one deliberate course at a time, with the river itself doing half the labor. The reason for all that caution was buried behind the dams. Literally, nearly 100 years of sediment had piled up in the 2 reservoirs, around 30 million tons of it. Sand, gravel, silt, and rock that a healthy river would normally carry down to the sea a little at a time. Release all of that at once, and you would bury and choke the very habitat you were trying so hard to save. So, the removal was deliberately paced to let the river move roughly 20 million tons of that sediment downstream on something closer to its own terms. Even paced, it was violent to watch. The water ran thick and brown for months, so heavy with suspended earth that in places you could not see a hand held just beneath the surface. Turbidity, the raw measure of how much muck rides suspended in a current, spiked to levels many times higher than even a major flood had ever produced. Whole stretches that had run as clear mountain water for a lifetime turned the color of wet cement. In the short term, a lot of the fish and insects still clinging to the lower river simply could not breathe through it, and they died. This is the part the hopeful headlines like to skip. Restoration, while it is actually happening, does not look like healing. It looks like a wound. And for months on end, the Elwha gave almost no sign that the whole gamble was ever going to pay off. The project carried a price tag of around $350 million, making it until very recently the largest dam removal in the history of the world. By August of 2014, the last of the Glines Canyon Dam was gone. For the first time in 100 red years, the Elwha ran free from the mountains all the way to the sea, which left exactly one enormous question hanging over the entire thing. After a full century sealed behind concrete, would the fish even remember the way home? They remembered. They remembered almost immediately. Sam Brinkman, the chief fisheries biologist for Olympic National Park, and his teams had braced themselves for a slow, cautious years-long return. Nature flatly refused to wait. Within months, salmon were nosing past the old dam sites into water their kind had not touched since before the First World War. In the summer of 2012, Chinook began pushing upstream. Steelhead and Coup followed them into the tributaries. Within roughly 2.5 years of the first dam coming out, biologists had documented 8 different sea-run species back above the old barriers. Chinook, Coup, Saki, pink chum, winter steelhead, summer steelhead, and Pacific lamprey with bull trout moving freely again. On top of all of that, the numbers only climbed from there. Trout surveys that had counted around 3,000 fish in 2007 were finding more than 25,000 by 2019. More than 4,000 Chinook had returned by 2022. Some of those populations were not merely recovering. They were multiplying, climbing by well over 200% in the space of only a few years. And the river itself physically grew. All that released sediment did more than just pass through. Much of it settled at the river's mouth and built brand new land, adding roughly 70 acres of fresh estuary where shellfish and birds and young fish could shelter. Right near the mouth, the seafloor actually rose by around 33 feet as the sediment rebuilt the delta, reversing decades of erosion that had been steadily eating the shoreline away. The comeback climbed right up out of the water and onto dry land. As the old reservoirs drained, crews replanted the bare lake bed with something like 195,000 young plants, coaxing forest back on a ground that had been underwater for the better part of a century. And the animals moved in entirely on their own. Trail cameras strung across the former reservoirs caught deer, elk, black bears, cougars, bobcats, coyotes, and beavers, all reclaiming territory that had been drowned for 100 years. Ground that had been silent. Fighting for the dam removal was a long and grueling process of my ancestors. I wish they could see it now. See what has happened here. Lake bed for a lifetime was suddenly tracked with paw prints and hoof prints almost before the mud had finished drying. Then came the moment the tribe had waited a full century for. In the fall of 2023, the lower Elwha tribe opened a small ceremonial and subsistence fishery for coup, the first time in over 100 years that tribal members legally fished their own river after the dams. It was tiny and deliberate by design, just a couple hundred fish out of a run of several thousand. The tribe took 177 coup that first year and 189 the next. A natural resources technician named Vanessa Castle pulled 2 coho from the water on that opening day and described how it filled her spirit to fish exactly as her ancestors had fought for her to. Loretta Charles, the tribe's oldest living member at 91, remembered her own father catching salmon in this river as big as she was. But the return that stopped the scientists cold was the one absolutely nobody had counted on. The impossible return. Remember those summer steelhead? The run that was functionally extinct? Remember the 3 lonely fish counted across 4 full years of surveys before the dams ever came out? In 2016, just 2 years after the upper dam fell, researchers started seeing summer steelhead in the upper river again, and not a thin little trickle of them. By 2018, a snorkel team counting a single stretch of the Elwha tallied 341 wild summer steelhead in water that had held almost none of them. A run declared gone had reassembled itself in the span of a few short seasons. The obvious question was where on earth they had come from. You cannot rebuild a run from 3 fish. So the biologist ran the genetics, and the answer is the exact reason this whole story earns the word impossible. These new Ciron steelhead trace straight back to the rainbow trout, the very same landlocked rainbow trout that had been trapped above the Glines Canyon Dam for 100 years. Cut off from the ocean for a full century. Those trout had never once stopped carrying the genetic instructions to become steelhead. The instant the dam came out and the ocean was reachable again, some of their offspring simply did what their ancestors had always done. They went to sea, and they came back transformed. Sit with what that actually means for a second. A behavior, an entire way of life, survived 100 years of imprisonment with no chance to be expressed. Folded up invisibly inside a fish that to any casual eye looked like it belonged in a mountain stream. Not one of those trout had gone to sea in a century. Not one had tasted salt water. The instinct could not be practiced, could not be taught, could not be passed down by example, and it survived anyway. Written into them at a depth no wall could ever reach. The concrete that erased the summer steelhead from the lower river is the same concrete that accidentally preserved their blueprint in the upper one. Biologists had assumed a wiped-out run would have to be rebuilt slowly by hand, hatchery fish by hatchery fish over generations. Instead, the river rebuilt it for them out of raw material everyone had overlooked, sitting in plain sight above the dam the entire time. Nature had quietly kept a backup copy, and the fish, as it turned out, were only the beginning of what came flooding back. The ocean inland, the nutrients came back, too, in ways that reach far past the water. This is the part most people never really understand about salmon. They're not just fish. They are a delivery system hauling the richness of the open ocean up into the mountains inside their own bodies, then dying and feeding everything around them: the trees, the insects, the bears, the soil itself. Pull the salmon out of a river, and you do not just lose the fish. You slowly starve the entire forest that grew up depending on them. Scientists can trace it in the wood and the soil itself. An entire coastal forest built in part out of the bodies of fish that swam back from the Pacific to die here. So when scientists tested the blood of small river birds called American dippers, birds whose families had not seen a salmon run in a century, and found the chemical fingerprint of the ocean inside them, it meant the old machine was switching back on. Marine nutrients carried inland in the bodies of returning salmon were already moving back through the food web. The river was not just refilling with fish. It was rewiring an entire ecosystem from the stream bed all the way up to the birds standing on the banks. And the Elwha story did not stay on the Elwha. For years, it stood as the largest dam removal ever attempted. A real-world experiment a lot of serious people fully expected to fail. It did not fail. It became a blueprint. When the country later took on an even bigger job, tearing out a whole chain of dams on the Klamath River along the Oregon and California border, the Elwha was the proof of concept sitting right behind it. On the Klamath, within a single year of the major dams coming down, Chinook were already spawning in stretches they had been locked out of for generations. The lesson the Elwha proved is almost embarrassingly simple. Salmon do not need to be coaxed or reintroduced or micromanaged back into a river. They need the door left open, and they will find their own way home faster than any expert dares to predict. From the Pacific Northwest to Europe, aging dams are coming out. And again, the Elwha is the name people point to when they need to believe it can actually work. But the scientists who know this river best keep quietly adding one warning to all the celebration. Not finished. This is not over. Full recovery, the point where the Elwha's runs reach anything close to their historic size, is measured in decades, not years. The official targets are not expected to be met until at least the early 2030s, and realistically longer than even that. A river does not heal on a human schedule. It heals on its own in its own time. And the truth is, all we ever really did was get out of its way. Which brings the whole thing back around to Thomas Alwell standing over his canyon more than 100 years ago, breaking the law by refusing to build one single fish ladder. He believed he was burying this river salmon for good, trading 10 ancient runs for a little electricity. And for a century, he was very nearly right. But the same concrete that strangled the summer steelhead in the lower river is the exact structure that trapped their bloodline safely in the upper one and held it there intact until the day the wall came down and the ocean finally called them back home. The dam meant to end this river story is the single reason it ever got a second one. Today, the Elwha runs free from the Olympic Mountains to the sea, carrying salmon, sediment, and a warning worth remembering. As one biologist put it, national park boundaries do not protect rivers. People do. So, here's the question I want to leave you sitting with, and I would honestly love to read your answer down in the comments. If a run everyone had written off as extinct was hiding in plain sight for 100 years, sealed behind a wall, just waiting for someone to finally open the door, then what other lost thing is out there right now, still behind its own wall, waiting for us to tear it down? Tell me what comes to mind. And if this river's comeback moved you even a little, subscribe to the American Wild and stay with us, because there is another American comeback you need to see next, and it is waiting for you on the screen right now. Go watch it.